The UAR is subject to sale of buyer's property addendum. This is an important form that gets used every day. It's been in existence since 1999, with the latest version coming in July of 2020. This is meant to satisfy if a buyer checks under 2.2 of the REPC that they have to sell property that they own in order to purchase the seller's property. So in Section 1, the buyer clearly identifies which property they own that they need to sell. In Section 1A, it gives the buyer the right to cancel by the due diligence deadline or the financing and appraisal deadline, whichever is later, and allows the buyer to then get their earnest money back in completion. But under Section 1B, if the buyer passes the financing appraisal deadline or the due diligence deadline, whichever is later, it still allows the buyer the right to cancel on or prior to the settlement deadline in the REPC, in which case the seller agrees to accept from the buyer the earnest money amount as liquidated damages. That is meant to simplify things. So if I'm a seller and I accept this addendum, I'm going to want to make sure that I have an earnest money amount at stake that I feel comfortable with. Again, from a seller's perspective, I would want to have as much earnest money as possible. In Section 2 of this form, it outlines and asks specific questions. Is the buyer's property that they identified in Section 1, is it currently on a multiple listing service for sale through a real estate brokerage? And if it's not, then the buyer agrees that it will be listed on a multiple listing service within 7 days of acceptance of the contract between the buyer and seller. The whole point behind that is that we want to encourage buyers to use realtors, and we want to encourage buyers to list their property, because that is going to be an effective tool and an effective method in getting their property under contract and eventually sold. In addition, under Section 2, the name of the listing brokerage and the name of the listing agent are asked and required of the buyer. So they need to clearly identify that they are going to be using the multiple listing service and that they're using a real estate brokerage. In Section 3, it does allow the buyer to disclose affirmatively whether or not the buyer's property is already under contract. If it is, then it makes the buyer's offer much stronger. If it isn't, then certainly the seller uses that information in deliberating whether or not they want to renegotiate with the buyer, or whether or not they simply don't want to accept the buyer's offer as it is. So hopefully this form is simple and easy to use for all realtors.